Well, Jamie, I think we have known each other for 35 plus years, going all the way back to our our time. That makes it sound like it was hard time at Tacoma Falls College.
Doing time.
Doing time at
Mm.
TFC. I like that. Um, so why don't we spend some time today talking a little bit about kind of who we are and where we came from and how we ended up as pastors, and that'll be a conversation for the day.
That sounds like a splendid idea.
Wonderful. There's the dance. Hi, this is Two Pastors Talk, and I'm John. I'm a pastor at Westway Christian Church in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, all the way on the other side of Nebraska, from like 20 minutes away from Wyoming, Nebraska. And I'm with my good friend, uh, Father James Bozeman, who is on all the way on the other side of the country in Beaufort, South Carolina. And James
Hmm.
is the Father James at St. James Orthodox Church in Beaufort, South Carolina. And we have known each other for more than 35 years. It was 35 years
Oh,
last year.
yeah. Yep.
Um, and that has been, yeah, we've just known each other for 35 years. So what we
Yeah.
thought we would do today is just talk a little bit about kind of where we came from, how we became friends early on, and a little bit about our stories. Um, I've been thinking over the past week since I knew we were going to do this. Um, I think I feel like our first interaction was um like whatever August-ish, 1988 at
Yep.
Tacoma Falls College. Um, Maybe it was a meal. Maybe it was the. Do you remember that when we got to TFC, they had us take a Bible knowledge test? Do you
Yeah.
remember that?
Yep. Yep.
Um, so I
And I think
kind
we had
of,
to do all the pre-testing and everything.
yeah,
Yeah. That's
yeah,
what I remember. Yeah.
yeah. Like they wanted to know how smart we were biblically. Like, could we identify like what king was in this trial? I don't know.
Yeah.
That was
No.
probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but I don't think it's much.
Felt like
So
it.
yeah, so I feel like it was at dinner or something like that. Um, I don't know. What do you remember? Do you remember what that first like when
Well,
we first kind of met each other?
I remember Connie Brandenberry kind of introduced
Mm.
each other to each other because she kind of had the sense that we would get along because I think it was because we talked about the same music, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that was
yeah.
part of it. And I remember us sitting together in some place where we did the testing.
Hmm.
I'm not sure where
I
it
think it
was.
was the cafeteria.
It
I feel like
had to be.
it
It
was the
had to
old
be
cafeteria under
Laterno.
Laterno. Yeah,
It
yeah.
had to be because I don't know where else they would have done it because there was no
Mhm.
student center at the time.
Yeah.
I remember that. I remember that being a long, long day. And then I
Hmm.
remember the next thing I remember at all was us driving in your Turismo into town. And that was kind of sealed the deal. We just went off and did stuff. I
Yeah.
think we went to Walmart or something
Hmm.
together.
Yep.
That was it after that.
Hmm.
That's what I
Yeah.
just my earliest memories.
Yeah. Okay. So now that you mentioned Connie Brandenberry, yeah, that you're
Yep.
right.
Remember? Yep.
That was a connection. I'm curious, do you still have your yearbook from TFC?
I'm sure I do. I'm sure I do. I know Katie's kept them. I'm sure they're on our bookcase out in our living room. I'm sure of it.
Okay. I met when we moved from Iowa to Illinois in 2012, 2012, 2013. We got rid of a lot of stuff, and yearbooks sadly were on the list. Um, but all that to say, if sometime you want to get into that yearbook and take a picture of my photo,
I can do it.
I know my hair did not look anything like this
Nope.
at that time. And I
I had
think
a
I was wearing my U2 Joshua Tree shirt in that.
yeah. Hmm.
Um,
You got away with that.
I did. So yeah, so we've known each other for 35 years. What were you when you went to TFC? What was your so TFC, Toccoa Falls College, Toccoa, Georgia? affiliated with the Christian and Missionary Alliance.
Right.
Um,
Supposedly independent, but really CMA.
really CMA. Why were you at TFC? How did you end up there?
So my parents went there when they were in college, and I was born there. So I was born at right there, the hospital next to the college. Um, so I knew it, and I had friends who were going there. Among which was we were saying before, Glenn from Luxury was there,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
the band,
Yeah.
which yeah, that's part of the backstory. And I decided if I wanted to go. Actually, I was just trying to decide, do I want to go in the Air Force or what do I want to do? Because I thought about going to the Air Force, and I didn't have. I think my vision. I thought my vision wasn't good enough, and probably was good enough as it turns out, which is fine. It
Did you want
worked
to be a
out.
pilot?
Oh,
Is that?
totally, man. I
Oh,
wanted to
okay,
fly.
awesome.
I totally wanted
Okay.
to fly. Top Gun, that's
Yeah.
Navy, of course, but
Yeah.
I wanted to fly, so I thought Air
Yeah.
Force. But it didn't. It just wasn't where my head was. So I ended up going there, and I knew they had a I wanted to get into, if I didn't do that stuff, I wanted to do, the idea was to do radio, to get into radio, and I knew they had a communications department, and I
Hmm.
knew Toccoa, and I liked Toccoa, so I thought, oh, I'll try to go there, and it worked out. I ended up there supposedly to do broadcasting.
Hmm.
Supposedly.
Hmm.
What were you? I don't even know. What were you going to do while you were there?
Missions.
Missions. That's right. That's right. I
Yeah.
forgot about
So
that.
when I was in high school, we were connected to a Presbyterian church, and um, like my whole, I don't know, maybe that's a different conversation. Maybe that's a little bit later when we get into that. Um, but I felt like having grown up going to church, having grown up going on mission trips, I felt like God was calling me to the mission field. So my choice was um, Tacoma Falls College or Columbia Bible College in
Oh yeah.
Columbia, South Carolina. And I went to TFC on one of those campus preview weekends.
Hmm.
Um, and like that was where I landed. Had no idea what I was getting myself into. Had no study skills. Um, barely passed high school, and got to TFC. And yeah, I felt like God was calling me into missions, and um, I had one of my ideas of missions. One of the years we went to Mexico, we went to this little village where we probably did I think we put a roof on a church or something like that.
Right.
And one of the things that kind of attracted me to one of the things that attracted me to missions was not only that, but I remember that one of this village that we had went to, they had uncovered this huge Mayan stone, and I don't know what it's called, but they were like trying to decipher it. So they had
Hmm.
like a some kind of paper on the top of it, and they're like, using something to bring out what's on the stone, and they wanted to decipher that. And I just thought, um, I was also a really big Indiana Jones fan. So if I could
Yeah.
somehow combine both of those things into one, like that's what I wanted to do. And
Treasure hunter, missionary,
yeah, and I just had
archaeologist.
no uh, yeah, I just had no idea of about anything as a 17-year-old going to Bible college.
Yep.
Um, and that was just a real, like, just from a backstory standpoint. Obviously, I met Ann there,
Hmm.
met you there, met lots of other people there.
Yep.
Um, but TFs, like, just in general, like I look back on those TFC years, like that was a real struggle.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and there were things I learned, there were ways I grew, but I don't know how much of that, with the exception of the relationships, I don't
Hmm.
know how much of that was actually positive
Right.
um, for me.
Yep.
So, um, yeah. So I didn't graduate from TFC.
Right.
We left. You, I went into the army for a very short
Short
period of
period.
time in the midst of all of that, and then when I got back and I got married and we moved to Iowa and finished out like all that kind of stuff there. So so you graduated from TFC.
Mhm.
Um, you mentioned the band Luxury.
Right.
Um, like how um, like why don't you maybe talk about kind of that TFC post TFC maybe to 2000 ish,
Yeah.
and then I'll kind of talk about what that looked like for me, and we can kind of move forward from there. So what like
Yeah. So,
TFC post TFC, like what'd that look like for you guys?
so you remember, I know you remember too, when we both got there, I didn't, I'd never been in a band before, but I had a guitar and I didn't have an amp. And our friend, mutual friend, obviously Glenn Black, who's in Luxury, plays drums for
Hmm.
Luxury, was there. And I'd known him since he was 17.
Mm.
Um, and I was hoping maybe I could try to be in a band while I was doing all this stuff. And I got the invitation from him and our friend Phil
Hmm.
to play. And so we started playing. Obviously, you know the story too. So we had that happen and music started being a thing.
Hmm.
And meanwhile, I started getting into the major and I hated radio. I decided I hate radio, but I liked TV. They had a TV thing. So I was doing TV editing. I think this is about the time you were probably about the time, but just around the time you were getting ready to move.
Hmm.
So we had the band going, one band going that kind of dissolved into another band, which was getting closer to what Luxury would be. Then eventually, probably I think I want to say around our third year. Actually, we're still there. You and I lived together before Katie and I
Yeah.
got married. Yeah, I
Yep.
forgot about that.
Yep.
That was great in
Yep.
the trailer. That was
Hmm.
awesome.
Yep.
So Luxury kind of formed when my brother and our mutual friend, Christopher Foley, got to TFC and we started the band and it was called The Shroud. And we started playing shows in Atlanta and playing in the area, trying to go around the whole area. Eventually, uh, I mean, it really led to me. I crammed 4 years into five, is what I like to say. You know, it
Hmm.
took me an extra year to graduate because I had dropped out for a little bit to get married and to pursue the music stuff. But by 93, or was it 94? I can't remember which now. 95. No, 94. I can't remember what it is. I graduated one of those years. I finished up, you know, but we had the band going. So I got my degree in broadcasting with an emphasis in television editing. And the year I graduated, the whole industry went from taking tapes
Yeah.
to digital, and I had no experience with digital nonlinear editing. And the whole industry changed on me and we were not ready for it. So I had very little marketable skills. So I made my way eventually to building furniture. So this is
Hmm.
what was happening for me. Getting out of school, Luxury was taking off. We got signed to Tooth and Nail Records in 1994. I was building furniture for a living to try to keep. I was married, you know, trying to keep a roof over our heads, and the band gets signed. And so in the 90s, for me, I finished up with TFC. For me, TFC was it was really hard. I think I got in trouble a lot, but it was like I wouldn't never trade those years for
Yeah.
anything because it
Sure.
was a really good formationally for me. I kind of learned how in a good way to fight the man, you know, a
Hmm.
little bit, but like to try to pick the right battles, you know. And spiritually, I guess it just kind of kept me on life support.
Mm.
I wasn't bad, but I was just blasé. I was mostly concerned about music. So in the 90s, you know, we had graduation from school, Katie and I getting married. You guys got married. The band gets signed, take off, and of course, in the middle of the 90s, for those who know about our band, we had a bad accident, and it changed everything. It changed
Hmm.
our whole trajectory. We're just getting ready to take off. Like it was
Yeah.
just the record deal was there, the
Yep.
support was there, the money was there, and then we really got messed up by that. But in a lot of ways, I mean, I'm super grateful it happened. So the end of the 90s after that for me was still doing music, trying to figure out like what does life look like because suddenly you realize you're mortal, you know, you can
Hmm.
die very
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
And that was sort of a kind of the point at which spiritually like I was kind of teetering. I wasn't sure where I was going with what my spiritual life was, what I was going to do with music. I knew how to keep, you know, bread on the table, but what was I going to do with the rest of this? That was kind of the
Mhm.
90s for me. The end of the 90s my wife had been really concerned about my spiritual life and just how blasé I was, and she had started praying for me at our pastor's request. We're going to a place called Foothills Alliance Church, and I didn't know this for years that she had been like talking to him and praying for me. And about the end of the '90s, like I kind of just, well, I guess because our oldest son, Katie, was pregnant with our oldest son, and I thought I need to get my head screwed on straight because this isn't going to work for him.
Mm,
So I kind of started rethinking kind of my spiritual life, still playing in the band, had a couple bands going at that point. Um, but I think by the end of the '90s, heading into 2000, like I was finally kind of things were turning around. I had a whole resurgence. Some of that was orthodoxy was happening in the background, and a lot of it was the band. I'm sorry, the accident that happened to the band was very life changing.
mhm.
Um, so yeah, for me, that's kind of where we were once Y2K hit.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so we left when we moved. Um, I would say, like, I don't want to, Anne obviously we were married, and she's a big part of this as well. And I would say that where we were is spiritually, like we did not have a relationship with Jesus.
Right.
I would definitely like, and I don't know, were we Christians, were we not Christians? That's not for me to
Yeah.
decide.
Yeah.
But Christ was not the focus of either of our lives.
Mm.
And we just sort of kind of went to church because that was what we did. And so we moved to Iowa in that case, in that situation, and then we moved to Savannah. By that point, I was working at
Hmm.
Best Buy. And I know, like, there were several times in the '90s where we got together. We came up to
Yeah.
Savannah. You guys came down
Yep.
a couple times. So we kind of maintained that,
Hmm.
that relationship that we had. Um, and then we moved to Ohio, and it was there where for us, we got connected to Marysville Christian Church.
Right.
Um, and uh, that was a real turning point for us, for both of us. We heard, I would say we heard the gospel.
Hmm.
We had the pastor that we had was very focused on teaching through scripture,
Right.
and that God used that to change our lives, to transform our lives. And at the same time, it's interesting that you talked about Katie's influence and what she was doing to to um, to be a conduit for God to work in your life. It was the very same situation for us. We had
Hmm.
kids right away after we got married,
Right.
and I know that as when I say we started going to Marysville Christian Church, at that point I was probably working 3 Sundays out of the month.
Yeah.
So when I say we, it was more her than me. But I think her spiritual kind of reawakening happened long before mine did.
Hmm.
So she kind of just, prayed, very similar to what you talked about, praying for mine, and just matters of faith became more important, became the priority in our lives. And God was just at work in the midst of all of those things. And that also, like, brings us, like you said, Y2K as a as a marker. Um, at that point, so that's 2000 for us. Well, it's 2000 for everybody because it's
Yeah.
Y2K. But 2000 for us, we were still in Ohio, and we were very much in a place of, I was working at Best Buy, making like way more money than any 29 or 30-year-old ought to
Yeah.
make at that age, and completely just like completely dissatisfied with life
Yeah.
because I can look back on it, and now the lens is because I wasn't living my life for Christ.
Yeah.
But completely dissatisfied with life. And then we moved back to Iowa, got connected to a church there, and really started understanding what Christianity was about, really starting to understand what church work was about in a lot of ways. Um,
When you moved to Iowa, what were you doing? Well, I can't remember. I know you went to school.
yeah, so when we moved to Iowa the first time from from Toccoa, I went to Dort College in Sioux
Mm-hmm.
Center, Iowa, and I was studying to be going to secondary education. I was going to be a high school teacher
That's right. That's
in
right.
history, and
I remember
like in kind of in the midst of that, started working at Best Buy
it. Mm-hmm.
and fell in love with retail.
Mm-hmm.
And not only did I fall in love with retail, but I fell in love with the money that came
Yeah.
that came with that. And then like that was the to Savannah trajectory, and then back up to the Midwest in Ohio was really pursuing those things, and it was in the midst of that whole piece of like one more piece in that puzzle of not finding satisfaction
Yeah.
in the things of this world
Yeah.
and only finding satisfaction in Christ. Um, and then when we got back to Iowa, and again, like that, really started to understand what the call of God was on my life, on our life, and what that looked like from a church context. Um, really kind of changed things.
Oh yeah.
Um, and then you guys came to see us in Sioux Center.
Yeah. Yep. That
Um,
was fun.
it's like 2002,
I think so because we weren't in the
2003.
Orthodox Church yet. I remember we were
Yeah,
looking.
and you were like right like
Yeah, we're
I
on the
remember
edge.
those conversations
Yeah.
in our living room
Yeah.
of that. So yeah, so that kind of catches me up to that point. So maybe fill in that gap
Okay.
of
So,
what happened post 2000, and like it all runs together, but what happened in that
well,
in
yeah, and it all connects. I mean, like whenever I talk about, because like we were talking about this last week, and you were trying to think of how to put this, my
yeah,
conversion to Orthodoxy.
yeah, yeah.
So to backtrack, I grew up in the CMA. My dad was a pastor in the CMA, Christian Mission Alliance, for years and years. After college, was at a wonderful Christian Mission Alliance church with a wonderful pastor whom I love to this day. And he was very patient with me.
Mm,
In the 90s when I was just so bleh, I was just like I'd come to church on Sunday, that was about it. And I never thought about that. It just was like, well, it's just what I'm doing. And by the end of the 90s, when I kind of got my head screwed on straight, what had been happening, I mean, it all ties together coming into the 2000s. What had happened is my friend Chris and my brother and other friends of ours had discovered ultimately what would be Orthodox Christianity. And as I always tell the story, there's like a 10-year window where like the first 5 years I was Apostle Paul, and I was out trying to stone them. Like this is craziness. And understandably, if you come from an evangelical background, you look at things like icons and saints and stuff. It's like this is all wrong. This is all wrong. And I get the reaction to that because I had the same reaction. I was very against it. I was the last of any of them to become Orthodox. And when I actually came to an Orthodox church one night in 2004, my friends couldn't believe it. They were in shock. My brother was like, "What? What are you doing?" But what I'd seen, what was probably what helped me most, just generally, conversion aside, after the accident, um, I watched, I watched particularly Father Chris at the time, and my brother especially, he was just not especially a spiritual oriented person. The band was trying to figure out what we were. Are we Christian? Are we a
mm,
Christian band?
mm,
We're all Christians here. And we decided at one point we're a moral band. Like, what does that even mean? But at the time, it seemed like a good compromise. So we don't have to say we're Christians, but we were Christians. And then we had the accident, and then you realize how mortal you are, and you see how good God is and how He preserves you. And my brother had this complete renaissance, and I was just kind of flabbergasted by it. And it was all due to the fact that he had discovered the Orthodox Church, or at least what he would realize at one point was the Orthodox Church. And it totally changed him. And I watched him, and I watched my friend Father Chris, and watched our friend Russ, and I watched other friends who I had known before that just go through these radical transformations. These
mm,
were people who, generally speaking, in the evangelical life that they led, it wasn't a problem. It wasn't like they were living poorly. Just there was some quality that I couldn't put my finger on, that all I could say is this is due to them. This is their orthodox, and this has changed some other thing that's sort of outside of my reach. I can't get to. And I would have conversations with them. I remember in the late 90s, we would, one of the two bands I was in, there was luxury, but there's also they sang as they slew,
Mhm.
and they would come to our rehearsals, and we take a quote unquote smoke break, for a couple of the guys in the band smoked, and so I would go out while they're smoking, and I'd talk with Chris and Russ, and we'd talk about spiritual things, and one of the other guys in the band was pursuing it too, and have these heavy conversations. They would just kind of shake their heads and be like, "You just, you need to look into orthodoxy," but they would never push it. They just kind of threw it out there. I'm like, maybe someday, maybe someday, maybe someday. But really, it started to change me because I went from being really against it to saying, even if I don't want to become that, there's something here that I need to figure out how to get my hands on. And so that was happening to me around 2000. Like when we visited you guys, obviously we were probably pretty obnoxious about that to some degree, because like when you start to discover it, you're like, oh, I've got this thing. You want everybody else to see it, and they can't see it until they see it.
I don't think we were really concerned.
Well, naturally, why wouldn't you be?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you be? It sounds like, I mean, the proof, it's the only way to prove it to people, and this is the only thing that's worked for us, is by being in it, demonstrating. I mean, for evangelicals, the thing about us as evangelicals, I'll speak as like one of the evangelicals, is we've grown up with misunderstandings about a lot of these things that are true about the gospel, about the church, and about history. And we're just disconnected from the things that would help us to see it more clearly. And not everybody's going to take the route that I took, like I've said before in this podcast, but I took it eventually, and I was the last one of my group, of that group there, to do it. And but I think for me it was, I mean, I didn't want to become Orthodox. It wasn't like that. I was like, I really like this. What can I do to take all these things that I like and bring them into my church, and then try to make something there so I don't have to leave, so I can stay here with these
Mm,
people and not have to leave this tradition. So that was kind of the early 2000s of like trying to figure out how to like
mm,
take what I was seeing, the teaching, the stuff that I could. I mean, there's things I couldn't. I mean, our church wasn't about to like put icons on the wall.
mhm,
Who can blame them? I don't blame them. And I wasn't sure I wanted that, but I was trying to like take these things, and it wouldn't have worked, as it turns out. And then I actually went and visited the church finally for a service, because I just felt like I had to see this. And I had a couple friends that were there. Most of my friends were gone for that night, and it was not. I mean, it was not the highlight of like if you were gonna plan I always say it this way: if you were gonna plan to present the Orthodox worship at its highest and best, because when people come in, you think like they need to see everything working, all,
yep.
let's say it's a 12-cylinder engine, like, really fine racing motor, all 12 cylinders firing right, the pressure's got to be right, the sound's got to be right. And that was not the case when I visited. And it was a mess. The church was kind of a mess. They had gone through some really difficult times, but something about it um, absolutely clicked. And
Mhm,
I saw whatever it was I needed to see. Still, I say to this day, I've seen a lot of incredibly beautiful Orthodox church services, in beautiful big churches with all the pomp and circumstance that sometimes is off-putting. But for me, I still find to be very beautiful these days. And there's never been a service that I've ever experienced like that one in
mm,
Toccoa, at that little church with like 8 of us there.
mm,
Never, nothing's touched it. And I think it's just because at that moment I was willing to see, and God
mm,
said, "Here's something to see." So for me, that was kind of what happened in the early 2000s. I was going
mhm.
through this sort of changeover, this conversion that I didn't even know I was going through.
Yeah.
I talked to people. I probably told you the same thing, and maybe someday we'll be Orthodox. I don't know, but we're finding we're convinced more and more by what we're seeing, scaring you guys, scaring my family, scaring our friends at our evangelical church. And here we are just trying to stay evangelical and
Yeah.
being drawn to this thing. And so, of course, here we are,
Yeah.
you know.
I I think back to our second episode that we did, what is worship? I
Yeah.
think one of the questions I asked you was like, are you an ex-evangelical? And we kind of talked through that. We talked a little bit about deconstruction.
Right.
Um, and it's like when I think back to where I was then in that same time period of, and I think the phrase I use I've more maybe the phrase I more prefer is like having a crisis of faith. And I think back to
Yeah.
I think back to where I was in 89 to 93, um, bringing my own immaturity into Tacoma Falls College,
Mhm.
um, not really understanding anything. Like that was a real crisis of faith.
Yeah.
That was I would say certainly that was a deconstruction of like everything I thought I knew about Christianity.
Oh yeah.
And my response in that was to still participate in the things of the church, but
Mm.
really not live with any integrity to it.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting you said it's not like people were living like I wasn't a bad person.
Hmm.
Which I mean
I know what you mean by that. Yeah.
that's another category. Maybe that's another, but maybe that's a gospel oriented
Yeah.
podcast we could have. Like
Yeah.
I wasn't a bad person, but I wasn't a Christian person.
Yeah.
Um, so it kind of in that 2002 to 2005 phase for me, it was very much like, man, I'm not sure what I believe about Christianity.
Yeah.
And and there were a lot of things I think that were happening in the evangelical world, um, of like I remember like Relevant magazine,
Yeah.
when it was I'll say when it was good. um, I remember I was kind of I was kind of exposed to this to this other side of Christianity, and maybe it was like maybe it was an early version of progressive Christianity or quote unquote liberal Christianity, or like there was this side of Christianity that I I I had never been exposed to before, and it was turning up lots of thoughts and questions in my own mind. And like now I can look back on it, and even then like there was a semblance of what I'm experiencing is a crisis of faith right now.
Mm.
I'm not sure what it is I believe or why it is I believe it.
Right.
I remember this before, and the path that I took before 89 to 93, 94 was I'm like, okay, I'm done with this.
Yeah.
And I knew, and like I at least had some presence. And I think this is just all like God's great gracefulness, God's
Hmm.
grace operating in the midst of that. Like I knew I didn't want to go down that path, like because that was a dead end.
Yeah.
Um, but then like kind of where does that leave me? And kind of what I then like my MO at that point was like I knew what I had enough presence of mind to say I know what I knew what conservative evangelicalism like taught and promoted and all of that kind of stuff. So maybe what I ought to do is see how the other kind of how the other half live.
Right.
So exploring some like again like some very early on progressive slash liberal Christianity, like taking in some content, being challenged by that. Um, and thankfully I had a friend who was living with us at the time who had been a guy in our youth group back in Ohio and was now the worship leader at our church. And he was 10 years younger than me. Um, and we went down this path together of just really being challenged in what we believed. And coming out of that, like as much as that was a deconstruction slash crisis of belief, I actually was felt more um, the foundation of Christianity. Like I came out of that deconstruction not with not by leaving the faith, but feeling more grounded in it than I ever had.
Yeah.
But it was only by like really trying to consider this other side like honestly,
Hmm.
um and coming by whatever those essentials, convictions, and preferences. We talked a little bit about that last time.
Yeah.
Like, I felt like coming out of that second deconstruction crisis of faith, like I, like I now had, like I came by those opinions and those thoughts and those essentials honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had done the work.
Right.
Um, and then that led to going back to school. So you said you crammed 4 years into 5 years. I graduated in 2006 with
Yeah.
my undergrad. So I crammed 4 years into 18 years of of school. Um, so that like that was just kind of where I was, how I came through that phase
Mm-hmm.
of not leaving evangelicalism, but still like wrestling with like what does it mean to be a Christian?
And probably too for you, I'm guessing. I mean, probably one of the things I would say about myself, and you'd probably agree, is there was a point at which I know for myself, right around 1999, where I'd been so blasé, and I remember,
Mm.
this leads back to our question, kind of before we started this
Mm-hmm.
participation in church. I had been very loosely involved with our church in Toccoa. Well, it was in Seneca, South Carolina. But there was a point at which I remember at one of our annual meetings, I think it was 1999, where I actually gave some input. And I remember the input itself, number one, for some reason, was very, very helpful to the meeting at that moment. And my pastor at the time realized like he suddenly had his hook in me, and I realized I wanted to be hooked. I wanted to be connected to this church. And so that for me, that was a pivot point. Like I started having, I guess the thing would be not only the spiritual conviction that something needed to change. I needed to own my own faith and not have it be something that was somebody else's or my parents or something. But I needed to be like, I needed to be honest. But then also too, that became connected to the conviction that I needed to be like participating in the church more, and like there was something in that was actually that I liked, that I wanted to be a part of. Um, and so that was like for me was probably your kind of coming through investigating. For me it was coming out of a period where I realized like I had come dangerously close to losing my faith. Like
Mm-hmm.
had I think for me, had I not made kind of that movement, had orthodoxy not been in the background for me, and had I not and I had not had friends who were really working on their spiritual life like my friends were, my brother was, and if my wife hadn't been praying for me, and if I allowed things to kind of continue a certain path, I don't know where I would have ended up. I mean, like you
Yeah.
say, God's grace is incredible, just that presence in your life, whether you kind of look for it or not. So, like, I think maybe for you and probably for me too, there was that moment at which our faith became, in a sense, our own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's I think about that, especially when you look at people, young people today who struggle, or even adults, but certainly younger people who struggle when they kind of look at where they are, if they're going to church and it's like they're like, I don't like they go their whole life as kids, they get to 18 and then they feel like, well, I've lost it. And so now I'm not going to go at all. And oftentimes in the Orthodox Church, people will have kids, and that's sort of the kicker. It brings them back to the church. They want to get their kids
Mm-hmm.
baptized.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I need to rethink what I left, but that's not even happening that much, these days. So I wonder too, like maybe in our experience, if that's something that can feed into helping people to stay in the church, to stay connected,
Yeah.
to realize there's some ups and downs that maybe you've got to go through,
Yeah.
where you have to shake off, maybe in a sense, shake off what your parents have shown you so that you can pick it back up again and be your own person in that same faith, faithful to that.
Yeah. And this is, so Ann and I, we did this a couple years ago when all of our kids were here for Christmas. We had she and I had a discussion beforehand of at some one of the nights that all of our kids are here, we are going to have a why I'm still a Christian
Yeah.
conversation. And and we did that and it was really like it was wonderful. It was really good. And I think this can be something that that would be really helpful for people.
Mm.
Like it's worth I didn't know this was going to be a deconstruction conversation. Like it's, I mean, it's worth the battle. Like
Yeah.
it's
Mhm.
something that you are allowed to enter into. And when you talked about what, like, TFC was what it was for you, and you wouldn't
Mhm.
trade that. Like I don't think I shouldn't say I don't think I
Yeah.
wouldn't trade that either.
Yeah.
I don't know that I don't think I would trade my first crisis of belief deconstruction that led me to
Yep.
wander from the
Yeah.
church.
Yeah.
Um, and that was something that um that a few years into into the ministry where I was in Cedar Rapids, that was something I really kind of struggled with. Like when I looked back on that time, especially when I was in a real phase of in our student ministry there, where our student ministry were growing, and kids were making decisions to to for Christ, to become Christians. And like I was really tempted to look back on that and been like, man, if I wouldn't have been God, if I wouldn't have been such a loser from 1989 to 1984 or 1994, like I could have entered into this phase earlier. But that made me.
Yeah.
I can't look back on that way. And I I I guess maybe this gives me some pause in how I think about what I see in people deconstructing right now. What if I remember one of the frustrations I had when I was coming out of that second one, where I felt like I had done the work. And I remember people asking me questions, and sometimes those were accusatory ways.
Yeah.
Um, and it was like, no, but you don't understand. Like I actually did the work on this. Like I came by this opinion honestly. And I think a caution maybe for me, maybe for you, maybe of the three people that are going to watch this, like as maybe we need to figure out a way to not be to demonstrate a little bit more grace to people who are entering into that
Hmm.
deconstruction phase, and realize, God, just as God has used those things in my life and in your life, like he's probably using that in someone else's life. And man, I hope so. Like I want to
Hmm.
enter into that, and I want people to enter into that. Um, like I would prefer people enter into their deconstruction phase the second way that I did,
Yeah.
of with an awareness and like an appropriate way, rather than the first way, which was, I'm not sure I agree with all this stuff, and I'm really frustrated because this thing happened at this Bible college that I went to, and they made me feel crappy because I had an earring. Um, so, to
Yeah.
hell with Christianity.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, like it doesn't have to be that way. It
Mm-mm.
didn't have to be that way for me, but then again, maybe it did.
Well, it was what it was, you know.
Yeah.
I think about that a lot. I'm with you. Like for me, I keep thinking, I wish I had been less stubborn. I wish I could have discovered orthodoxy with my friends, you know, like that would have been really cool to go through. But then again, there are things about it too that I look back and in my own limited perception, the time that we came into the Orthodox Church, we were fortunate to miss some very difficult moments in the church that we came into. And so in some ways I think we were spared. That might have been too much for
Mm.
our faith. I mean, just looking, looking from a human perspective. But I think having the opportunities to um I don't love the term deconstruction just because I'm afraid of the connotations, but I get what you're saying. To be able to sort of to be able to take apart something so you can look and see what it's made of,
Mm.
like my faith in 1988 when I got to college was my parents' faith. But then I was free and I could just do whatever I wanted
Mm.
to do suddenly, and that was a very liberating. And then I know I made there were points where I had to say to myself, "Am I? What am I going to do with this freedom?" And I think my conscience was very strong. It kept me from a lot worse things than could have been. Um, but watching people, I think preparing ourselves pastorally and as communities to see our kids grow up and then just not know if they want to stick it out and be able to say, well, maybe you've got to go through that. Maybe that's needed. Not like you would like you said, it's like I'd rather, in one sense, if there's an image in the scripture, it's like the prodigal son and his older brother, right? So the older brother never leaves.
Mhm.
He's really whining about the whole situation. He's mad at his dad, and I've always been here, and his dad has to correct him. Both of the brothers, the prodigal leaves and leads a wasteful life, but then comes back, and the older brother, we don't really hear about him coming back, but he never leaves, but he does get to hear the correction of the father. So maybe the older brother's the best way to go, but
Mhm.
maybe all of us go through both of those things at different times.
Mhm. Yeah.
And the
I
prodigal, certainly, we don't want to be that if we can help it at all.
right. I like the way you described deconstruction as seeing how things work, and I think back to my childhood of like
Mhm.
I had a stereo record player, and like I remember being in my bedroom and taking that thing apart
Yeah.
because like I wanted to see I wanted to see how it worked,
Hmm.
but also I had to put it back together.
Hmm.
And there was an order and a structure that I had to put it back together in order so that it still worked.
Yeah.
And I think there are lots of implications for that I need to process. Because again, like I said, I came out of that second crisis of faith like no, I actually believed the exact same things that I believed beforehand with all of the messiness of it. Um, but I believe it because because I've done the work on it.
Yeah.
And I don't and I think some people do go through that deconstruction phase and like throw away parts of the record player.
Yeah. I'll do
And
without this. Yeah.
and I'm not sure that that works.
Well, it makes me think of a patristic story. So Saint Irenaeus of Lyons is a great saint of all of Christianity. He's one of everybody's, doesn't matter who you are,
Hmm.
is one of your church progenitors. He's one of our ancestors. And I think it was I always forget this. I'm sure it's Saint Irenaeus. I'm pretty sure it's in the text against heresies, so he's dealing with heresies.
Hmm.
And he talks about, and we've used this a lot in what we would call Orthodox evangelism to talk about our perspective on Scripture, but I think it applies to this, where he says, you can take this is what people do now. They'll take the Scripture apart, they'll deconstruct it, and this is the negative version of that, and then they'll take it and they'll put it back together. But the Scripture, you have to imagine it to begin with was an image of a king, so it's a mosaic of a king. It's
Hmm.
all these little pieces, and there's a picture there already before you ever did anything to it. It was given to you, and you decide, obviously, to take it apart to see how it works. But then when you reassemble it, St. Irenaeus would say, when you do it wrongly, um, without a number of things, we'll just say it that way, certainly without the guidance of the church, you'll end up with the image of a fox, which was not a good thing. You don't want that's like a really super negative image for St. Irenaeus to use, because a fox kind of is a dirty animal, kind of a
Hmm.
dog that smells and makes horrible yelping noises, or some other thing. And he said the point of it is that there's the one image, and I think for us, at least for me, it was like trying to discover what I had done to the image, so to speak. What
Hmm.
had I taken apart? What is the way to put this thing back together properly, um, to come up with the right image? And I think that's probably the challenge. You could apply that to a lot of different things, but certainly I think, like you said, the record player thing, you could
Hmm.
rebuild that. It's funny. My dad used to get so mad at me because I'd take apart all our stuff at home all the
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
you could take it, you take a record player apart and you've got motors and stuff in there that you could repurpose to build other things with them, and they can be perfectly good things, but you won't have the record player anymore. It won't do it. And so there's a fidelity to what is true, like
Mm.
what is objectively true. That, I mean, for of course, for me, I think the answer for that was was orthodoxy, was to say, well, this is the container, this is holding all the pieces,
Hmm.
it puts them back in the best order. But even at that, it's more like, when our people are especially when they're younger and they need to like pick up the pieces and go, what is this? There needs to be somebody by them to go, okay,
Mm,
I know you want to move it over here, but it actually belongs here,
mm.
or when you're reassembling the record player, don't forget to put the drive belt back on. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
or and you forget, and it's like you got to take the thing apart again to fix it.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff there that has to be thought through. Does
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
make sense? I mean, the mosaic
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
100%.
I always like that story.
Yeah.
Good old Saint Irenaeus.
Yeah. So we've had, I think this is why, I think this is one of the reasons why this conversation that we've been having and hopefully going to continue to have,
Yeah.
like, I think this is why this works is
Hmm.
because we've we've come from pretty similar background, at
Hmm.
least
Yep.
post 1988, and we've been just that journey's been very similar. We've ended up in like two disparate but yet very similar spots.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean that's in my mind, like I think of one of the things we talk about here all the time is Ephesians 4 and talk about like unity, not uniformity.
Mm.
Um, and the goal is to be unified and to proclaim the gospel and to maybe receive and experience the gospel in similar yet disparate ways as much as that's possible. Um, so now you are in South Carolina.
Yeah.
How long have you been there?
It'll be 12 years in June. Hard to believe. 12 years here. Yeah, because we left. We so you moved, but Katie and I stayed in Toccoa
Hmm.
till for
Yeah,
20 years. We were there from
yeah.
19. I was there from 1988. She was there from 1984 until 2009,
Hmm.
and through an even bigger series of events, that's bigger than this story can even hold. Somehow, I went from doing the music stuff and building furniture to my brother basically talking me into going to seminary. And which was we were talking about this last night, which was a huge leap. It was like it was a complete leap in the dark for me. Um, so yeah, 2009, we decided we're going to do this. A lot of things were happening around 08, 09 for everybody, with the economy being in a weird place. And my situation wasn't immune to that. My brother's wasn't. And it seemed like a good time just to go and, spend 3 years, suffering in a seminary, basically, in
Hmm.
a good way. It was good
Right,
suffering.
right.
Um, but one of the things about that I keep thinking back to, people ask me a lot of times about, like, when it comes to that kind of stuff, like, how do we know God's will?
Mhm.
Like, how did you know to go? And I'm like, I always say, I always kind of blamed it on God at first. I'm like, well, you told me to go to seminary, and I think there's a call to that, but and there's certainly, it's funny, in the seminary chapel there's an icon of Christ where he's holding the gospel, and it says, you do not choose me, I chose you. And
Mm.
that's very comforting as a seminarian, because you're standing there in the choir section. We have this a cappella choir, and you're staring at that icon where I could see it. I'm like, great. But then, like, probably really between I don't know, my second semester there, my third semester, like, I had my own crisis, like, why am I here, and I had to own up to it. Like, I'd made a choice to go, and that was like so liberating. I'm like, okay, I chose this, but I've asked God to bless it. So when people ask me that, I always tell them, I could have stayed, I could have skipped seminary, stayed in Toccoa, asked God to bless me working as a furniture builder. I could have been at my church there, St. Timothy's in Toccoa, and really just, it would have been just fine. God
Mm.
could bless that. But, I made other decisions, like, much like you, like leaving. There's that sense, that compulsion, that God's kind of saying, if you'll go, I can do this, and but there was, like, I didn't ever feel pressure to do it. I just felt like this is a chance to serve the Lord,
Yeah,
if that's what he wants.
yeah, yeah. And that was very much our thing in 2004.
Yeah.
We went to a youth ministry convention. I was like serving as a youth pastor at like bivocationally in a church, and we went to a youth ministry um, convention. And I'm just like all these people were talking about the full-time ministry
Hmm.
piece, And it was like, obviously that was something that was missing from my life. And our conversation for 8 hours on the on the drive home from Joplin, Missouri was, how does a 30, and you're going to resonate with this, how
Yeah.
does a 34-year-old
Yeah.
go into ministry? Like
Yeah.
practically, what does that look like?
Yeah.
And yeah, it just felt like that was what God was calling us to do. And it was a choice. We could have continued to do what we were doing. But like, just one more piece in that puzzle of not, like, we just didn't feel overly like we were completely being obedient to what God was calling us to. And that choice was there, presented to us. Um, so that was what, yeah, I mean, that was just what we did. We wanted to be obedient. We wanted to follow that call. Um, so
What the
that was
one
on.
the one difference I would say too, it's interesting to me, I always look back on this, is that I had said, I when I started serving as a layperson, serving around 1999 in our the church in Foothills, in Seneca, South Carolina, I had said a million times, and I don't think a million's an exaggeration, I will never be a pastor. I'll never do
Mhm.
that. I'd seen it, firsthand. And when I got involved with that church, I thought, I'll help out. I can do that. I can help out here, but I'm not going to be a pastor. And I ended up helping to teach some classes and stuff. And I was an elder and stuff like that, but I'll never be a pastor. And we became Orthodox. And it sort of changed something in me where I was like, well, I can see how I could do more, because we have the more ordained roles, obviously, like a deacon. I can help our priest out, but I'll never be a pastor. I'm not doing that. I don't want anything to do with that, because I just wanted to be free to do other work. And then, because I knew how it was, and then I go to seminary and they ordained me, and so I've been I've been a pastor for 12 years.
That's awesome.
It's crazy. I'm just not, yeah. And I wouldn't change a thing. That's the crazy thing, is I never wanted this. I did not want this.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it's the best thing I've ever done. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But it's like, I'm sure you feel the same way. Even when you get, difficult messages from people or criticisms or whatever else, still, at least for myself, I can say, like, I spent a lot of time trying to search for, like, what is it that I need to do, like, at the music, and I had the furniture building, and I was trying to figure out what to do. And I would do this in my company building furniture, or I was a project manager for a little while. Didn't go very well, because I don't have the skills for that, apparently. I don't know why I'm a pastor. But um but then I went to seminary, much to my own surprise, and was ordained and came into this. And it's like, as I tell my sons, like, really, for the last decade, I've never thought anything about anything else. I don't have any other desires.
Hmm. Yeah.
This is who I am.
Hmm.
So that's very cool. I mean, you don't think about it. It's like you wake up one day and you're like, I don't have that weird searching feeling in myself anymore. I don't feel like there's some other thing.
Yeah.
At least for me, at least, it's like, I don't. This is where I am. I'm in Beaufort, South Carolina. I have no intention to go anywhere else. I plan to die
Hmm.
here. I
Yep.
want to. That's what I want to do. That's a great feeling.
Hmm.
Not
Yeah.
everybody has that, but I do.
Right. Well, and that was born out of God's grace,
Yep.
top of the list,
Yep.
and a lot of hard work and time and effort and energy
Mhm.
and
Struggle.
processing and
Yeah.
faithfulness and all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff on our side of things. Um, so this has been way longer than our normal. I'm
All right.
curious, do you like, I have a something that has been on my just something that's been on my mind just relationally for years. Um, like this will be I think one of the strangest moments of our relationship. Um, I don't believe, I know I've never told you this. One of the strangest moments of our relationship. I remember when we were living in Savannah, and this is like 94, maybe 94. You guys played at Pawleys Island, South Carolina, I think.
Yeah. No, it would have been. That would have been. It was around there. I think it was 90. I think it was 90.
We were in Savannah. We were living in Savannah because I drove up from Savannah to see you. So
Hmm.
it was sometime between um May of 94 to May, so maybe it was 95 to
It's spring
October
of
of 95.
it's spring of '95. It was in
Okay.
night before the accident. Yes.
Yeah. So
Yep.
I remember I drove up there, and it was the weirdest thing in the world for me was after luxuries, because I think you guys opened for somebody.
We did prayer chain. Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
okay, prayer chain. Okay.
Yep.
I remember you and I were sitting on a bench, and we were just talking. And the weirdest thing in the world for me was watching kids come up to you and ask you for your autograph,
That's so weird. Always weird.
because it was so it was so disorienting for me, because I mean, you were just Jamie.
Yeah.
It was just you.
Yeah.
You were just a person. And I can't, anytime I think of that moment, I think of the Kill the Famous. I think of the song Kill the Famous running in the
Hmm.
background. Because that,
Yep.
it was like the living, it was weird. That was a living embodiment, like the soundtrack to that moment
Hmm.
of just being there, having a normal, we were just talking about normal things,
Yep.
and just seeing people come up and want your autograph was it was the weirdest thing in the entire world for me.
It was weird then. Still is weird now.
Yeah.
Because it's weird. Do you remember that Mac Powell from Third Day was there? Did you know that?
I could,
Isn't that weird? Isn't that
I
weird?
didn't know what the connection was. I knew there was
Yeah.
some kind of third day connection. So when you said prayer chain, because I thought you guys had opened for third day.
Mm-mm. No.
Okay. Okay. So
Mm-mm.
Mac Powell from third day was there.
Before
That's
they
the
had
third.
really they hadn't had their break yet, and
Okay.
they were just they it was still a little in the future. And I remember, and Max, he's a good guy. Actually, I think he helped. I want to say he helped with our movie, actually funding the movie. Um, but he was there. I remember that thinking, how weird, and we'd played. We're just totally different worlds,
Mhm.
different music, different styles. Obviously, they're very talented musicians, whole different thing. But I remember thinking back how strange, like we had those weird moments, like he was there playing. We played actually not long and later in Atlanta, for we opened out a set, and right after us was Jars of Clay, which was kind of weird. Like all
Okay.
these people that got really big, and
Yeah.
we just had an accident, that's all we did. We just got in a wreck and made a movie about it. It was just kind of funny, all these really weird moments. But yeah, that was I'd forgotten you'd come up there, and Polly's Island is not that far from us now,
Yeah.
so obviously because you went,
Yeah.
and we actually not long ago went to that church where that show
Mm.
was.
Hmm.
And it's funny, it's probably been 3 or 4 years now, actually, but we got pictures while we were there. Just thinking back to that whole time. It was a very strange time, just before the wreck.
Hmm.
No idea what was coming.
Yeah.
It was a very weird time for
Hmm.
us, for me,
Hmm.
and probably for you being there too.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
It was very strange.
I forgot you were there. I kept thinking there was something I was missing from that show.
Yeah.
This was a long time ago.
Yeah. That was weird. That was a weird,
I
that was a
probably have
weird
pictures of that.
situation. Hmm. Well, awesome. Um, well, thanks for listening, watching this, letting us reminisce a little bit.
Two old men talk.
Yeah, two old men talk. I hope this gives some insight into um into who we are and how we got to where we are. Um, so thanks for watching. We encourage you to subscribe, take this stuff in. Maybe you have some questions you want to ask. Those are always fun. So if you want to leave a comment someplace, you can do that in the little comment section below. But yeah, this has been Two Pastors Talk. So thanks for engaging us today, allowing us to do this. And we look forward to seeing you next time. So later.